Leah from the United States, where I'm finally back, and welcome to the Wine Access Unfiltered podcast. Vanessa, it's good to see you. It's good to be back in the U.S. And how's it going? What did I miss? I've been in Portugal for a while.
I feel like you've been gone forever. Well, you missed sort of harvest really kind of wrapping up here in Napa Valley. A lot of people I've talked to, winemakers have just brought in sort of the last bit of the fruit. So this by no means means that they're going on vacation, because now they have all this wine in tank. So they still have a lot of work to do. But yeah, that's pretty much what you missed.
Good. Well, I saw a little bit of harvest over in Portugal. I just spent the month there in both the northern part in Porto and then down in Lisbon as well, and visiting some of the surrounding wine regions, which is conveniently our topic of discussion for today. So we're going to be talking all things Portugal. I don't know about you, but I feel like everyone is going to Portugal, not just me. There's been a lot of Instagramming and talking about the region, but have you been to Portugal yourself?
I have. I went several years ago. I stayed in Porto and in the Douro Valley, and it was so beautiful. The people were so nice. The wines, I think what surprised me the most and what I've still taken away is, I think a lot of us port as just being sweet fortified wines, but they make outstanding dry wines as well. So that really blew me away.
Excellent takeaways. I had some of the same takeaways. Really overwhelmingly beautiful region. And, you and I both live in Napa Valley, where it is beautiful all the time. And it took my breath away to be in the Douro Valley. I mean, truly stunning views, the Douro River, climbing through the region with these sloping hills that just go all the way down into it, terraced vineyards. I mean, just unbelievable. And then, the whole river just winds all the way through. So you can't see, from east to west, the whole thing. So it kind of makes it very magical in some ways. And it sounds like you got to stay out in the Douro, which I did as well. And they're very different, the Douro Valley versus like the city of Porto. And we'll talk about that relationship because it's a very, very important one within the region of Porto and the Douro Valley in terms of winemaking. I learned so much by being there, and we're going to talk about all this, but it just reminded me of the importance of visiting wine regions. I cannot tell you how different I felt about the region, how much I learned just by being there and seeing it all happen, and how humbling an experience it was, because it's not easy to farm these grapes in these regions.
No, I'm sure you saw when you were there these really, really steep hillsides, and they have these stone walls, right? These patamares that they've built to hold up the literally to keep the vines from falling down the hillside in many cases. But there's some people are now planting up and down the hillside as well. But those ancient stone walls on the hillsides, just tracing them, that's what I think of when I think of the Douro Valley.
Yeah. So much good imagery, all things that we're going to talk about later. And this is essentially your guide to all things Portugal. So, Portugal makes a lot of different wines, so we're not going to cover everything, but we're going to get to as much as we possibly can, including how these fortified port wines, dessert style wines are made, talking about the dry wines, talking about Vinho Verde, which is one of my favorite regions for producing really great, crispy white wines. Although I will say, I think the wine that we're trying today from that region really speaks to the progression of Vinho Verde and where they're like sort of headed. And then, of course, because everything ties back to how I eat, how to pair these wines, right? So we got to talk about what we're going to eat with the port, what we're going to drink, what we're going to eat with the Vinho Verde. So we've got a lot to cover. I want to jump into some of the current events that have been happening. I don't know about you, but I feel like I've been hearing all about these wines that are aged under the sea, like Little Mermaid style.
Yeah.
And it sounds like and I've never seen them in real person. Like I've just always heard that some people are doing this. It turns out that the FDA has finally approved the very first wine that has been aged under the Adriatic for sale. So we'll actually be able to buy these wines that have been aged under the sea, thanks to a lot of research and a lot of work done by this one particular importer and producer, I think from Croatia. But what's really interesting is they talk about the fact that, so essentially what's happening, and Vanessa, I'd love for you to dig into this a little bit, but they're taking these bottled wines and they're putting them in cages and they're aging them 100 feet under the sea, literally in the water. They're growing barnacles, and these wines are being aged for a year or two, right? And so they're saying that, it's under the water. You've got like the motion of the water going. Have you ever done any research on the actual benefits of aging wines under the sea?
No, because this is such a sort of, it's new phenomenon that no, I haven't. I think we talked on a previous episode about a wine that actually had a little seawater added to it, but
Yes.
this is different, right? So this is what I'm trying to sort out, and maybe we just need to try one of these bottles. It sounds like one of the major benefits is just for the aging process, right? It's cool, it's dark. But I don't know, and I guess you can add on that this sort of gentle wave, the motion they're saying is good for this. But I mean, I don't know how different that would be than just putting your wine, in a cave like we always have, and keeping it in a cool, dark, humid place. It seems like you could probably do this in a much more simple fashion. But hey, they're getting a lot of attention. I mean, I want to try one, so it's working.
I definitely want to try it. I'd be really interested. And I think there was an experiment that they did where they had aged wines in space, because I think also along the same lines, there's the pressure component, right? And underwater pressure allegedly intensifies aging. My question to you is, okay, so for wine to age, there has to be oxidant exchange, right? It's not just like a swooshing of like, this is why we age in cork, which is porous. And correct me if I'm wrong here, right? Like there has to be some level of oxygen exchange.
Small amount, yes.
Small, like not a lot, but like a small amount. Is that happening still if it's underwater?
It can't be.
Right?
It can't be. I mean, I think, like they have the benefit of the stable temperature, the humidity, all those other things, but no. And then I guess with the barnacles, and what does that do? I have no idea.
I just tell you that I ate barnacles in Portugal?
How were they?
Percebes. Delicious. Kind of between like a clam and like a snail. Real, like looks like a dinosaur claw and terrifying. But anyway, I ate barnacles. That's a thing apparently in like Spain and Portugal. Okay. But anyway, yeah, I don't know what the barnacle thing is. I don't know. To me, like it seems like a lot of work and a lot of hoops to jump through to age wine under the sea.
Yes.
And and we'll link all these articles as we always do in the description, but they had to get this approved by the FDA. They had to do a ton of like legislative work to make that happen, which can't be inexpensive. And I just wonder like what the real upside is, and like, is this really worth doing?
And is it good for the ocean? I mean, what if everyone started doing this?
Right. I mean, I guess to some degree you could claim that it's maybe more sustainable because, maybe you're not running
using electricity to stay cool. Okay, that is something.
But then, you still have like the manpower and like, how does that impact the environment under the ocean? Like there's so much that we don't understand. I think mostly we don't understand under the water, and I'm certainly not a scientist, so I'm not going to dig into that. But I don't know. It feels like there's a lot of variables at play, like unnecessary variables at play. And like, while I'm not a fan, I'm also just like, why? Like, what is the point of this?
I'm going to just say I'm a bit skeptical that it isn't really more like a marketing exercise, because look, we're talking about it, right? They made headlines and it's on top of mind for people. So who knows? Again, I will withhold full judgment until I actually get to try one of these wines, but it just seems like a bit of a stunt, in my opinion.
Yes, you're right. They did make it onto the Wine Access Unfiltered podcast, so they've arrived. Congratulations. Next up on the agenda, we had a lot to talk about this week, and ironically, I'm actually sitting here in Philadelphia. This is from the Philadelphia Inquirer. This is an article on Cabernet Blanc. Have you heard of Cabernet Blanc? We've got Cabernet Franc, we've got Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Pfeffer, if you want to get really geeky, and Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Blanc is now in the mix. Have you heard of it? Are you familiar?
I heard about it only when I read this article. This is, I think, fairly new. This was like a grape that was bred by Swiss breeders that it combines, I think, Cabernet Sauvignon and a grape called Regent.
Okay, and Regent is
It's a grape. It has both Vitis vinifera and Vitis labrusca, so both kind of European and American pedigree as part of it. But I personally have never had a wine made from it, so I don't know what it tastes like. But I think what was interesting about this is, okay, so it is making a white wine. They have bred these two grapes, which are red, to be a white grape, if I'm understanding this correctly. But also I think part of what they're saying is it's more resistant to fungal diseases in the vineyard, so potentially better for sustainable viticulture. What it tastes like, I don't know. I think they described it as kind of a cross between Riesling and Sauvignon Blanc. So I imagine it's dry and very aromatic, but I don't know. Do you want to try one of these?
Of course, I want to try everything. I I think it calls into question a few things. I think one is this idea of hybrid grapes, which we have traditionally sort of like poo-pooed in the wine world, right? Like it's like Vitis vinifera or nothing. But I think to your point, what we're seeing, and this is the bottling that they're talking about is actually coming out of France, but we're seeing a ton of hybrid varieties in meaning like these cross varieties between Vitis labrusca and Vitis vinifera. We're seeing them a lot in the United States, in states that are not California, Oregon, Washington, places that we're not traditionally used to seeing Vitis vinifera varieties. So I think it's interesting from the standpoint that we could potentially see more hybrid varieties like this getting a little bit more attention, and the fact that they potentially would be more fungal resistant and therefore wouldn't potentially need the sprays that some of these other varieties might need. So like I said, this article came out in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is of course in Pennsylvania, not exactly a state known for the best selection of wines. Something I do hope to change in my lifetime. I hope to like have an impact on this, making wine a little bit more accessible in this state, being from here. What I think is really interesting is that you can actually buy this wine from the PLCB in the state stores in Pennsylvania. So like so many things that you can't get, but like this particular wine, the PLCB was like, let's bring Cabernet Blanc in. Like that sounds like a great idea. Like no one will ever have heard of it, and I'm sure we'll have a million questions, but like let's bring it in because like all these wines have to be approved by the board. Like these are all purchased by the state and then they're distributed amongst the stores. It's a wild process in Pennsylvania and like really kind of like screws the consumer and the retailer in the end, or the restaurant in the end. But I just think it's so funny that like of all the things they could have chosen to bring in, they're like Cabernet Blanc. That's what we're going to do.
It sounds to me like someone had a little too many glasses of wine at lunch and came back and that stamp just sort of fell on the wrong piece of paper.
Either that or there's some like insider trading happening. I mean, I'm not trying to get like sued for slander over here, but I don't know. It just seems so funny that like in all your buying days, Vanessa, have you ever been tempted by like something like a Cabernet Blanc? You're like, what I think might really sell at Wine Access? Cabernet Blanc.
No. No, I have not.
Oh, God bless the PLCB. All right. Well, it is available for $13.99. It's 11.5% alcohol, which signals to me that there's probably a little sweetness there. So if you want to seek it out, it's on sale right now. So it's regularly $15.99. Not that we're trying to promote buying from the PLCB. I'm certainly not. What else do we want to talk about? I think since we're talking about Portugal today, our friends at Graham's, I was with the Symington family as you were, Symington's own Graham's. They released a limited edition bicentenary collection to mark a historic milestone. This is a really special project that they did that is comprised of 6 single harvest tawny ports, 6 classic vintage ports, including wines from the heralded 6394 and 2011 vintage. And they've all been aged in Graham's cellars in the Gaia region, which did you get into like Porto to see Gaia?
No, I did not.
So if anyone is visiting Porto or like that region in general, it is well worth going to Gaia. And like I don't want to like spoil everything, but like Gaia is where everything is aged. So traditionally what would happen is they would make the wines in the region of the Douro, they would vinify them, and then they would bring them down by ship to the region of Gaia, which isn't that far. It's just more coastal. And so they would age everything there. And so that's what's happening here. So when they say it's aged in their cellars, that's what they're talking about. It sounds delicious. And I'm a big fan of what Graham's does. The only thing I have to say is port is already a little bit complicated. I feel like this adds another layer of complexity that I didn't necessarily want in my life. But I also appreciate it. So like I feel both ways about it.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong here. Doesn't it actually come with a piece of furniture? Like you're not just buying the wine, you're buying
Oh,
the
yes.
cabinet that
Yes.
holds
Oh,
it.
thank you. Yes.
So and I think glasses come with it as
Yes.
well, wine glasses and maybe some other wine accessories. So I guess my question is, do they expect people to actually drink these, or are you buying it just to kind of have it as a display showpiece? Because I guess you could just fill it with new bottles, but once once you sort of ruin the overall value of the set once you take one out, and now you have this sort of like missing tooth in your cabinet, right?
Yes, one that one front tooth is missing once you drink the 63, right? Yeah,
Hmm.
I mean it's super beautiful, and the pictures online, I mean it's this rare Santos rosewood made cabinet made by a um Portuguese craftsman. Comes with a hand blown decanter. Jancis Robinson's glasses are in there. A Durand is in there. So it's kind of, you know what? Maybe I take back what I said. Maybe it actually doesn't add a layer of complexity. I think actually is what it does is maybe makes it easier to consume pork. Because they're giving you basically
Everything.
everything that you could ever possibly need to like get your port on, open it, drink it, and like live your best life in your whatever room you're going to place this very beautiful cabinet in. So
Yeah.
I think if you can afford it, does it say the price in here, by the way?
I didn't see that.
I didn't either. I can't imagine it's inexpensive though, right?
Can't be. It's got to be
Yeah.
limited edition. So, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
I don't know. I that the decor, it's a beautiful cabinet. It doesn't really
Yeah.
fit with my mid-century modern vibe I've got going on at home, but I would drink those wines for sure.
Would your best day in life be a mid-century modern cabinet with like a whole bunch of champagne vintages stored in there?
You know me so well.
Now that I can get on board with. No, I think it's cool. And I love that port is one of those things that gets overlooked a little too often. And I love that like Grams is just trying to make it fun and enjoyable. And I'm sure this is not accessible in price, but accessible in terms of how you consume it is lovely. So kudos to them. I don't think that I'm going to be able to afford it, but if anyone out there is buying it, please do Instagram it and tag us so we can see it in real life. Last but not least, Jason Woodbridge. What the heck is going
Oh
on?
my gosh. This, you can't make this up. I mean,
No.
this. Okay, so let me get this right. So he's in a dispute with Napa County because he wants to replant after the fire,
Mm-hmm.
but he cleared some trees. Is
Mm-hmm.
this right? And then
Mm-hmm.
the county is upset with him, but he's saying the trees were dead because the fire killed them. I didn't kill the trees.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. So Jason Woodbridge. So for those of you who are like, who the heck's Jason Woodbridge? Why do we care about this? Jason Woodbridge, founder, winemaker of 100 Acre, right? Like one of the most popular 100-point wines in Napa Valley, very expensive. And right now they are questioning what the verb to plant actually means. Like if anything has ever sounded more like legalese to you, like we're questioning what to plant means. I'm just going to read this because I think this is too complicated for me to try to summarize. A successful high-end winemaker filed an interesting lawsuit against Napa County last week, claiming that it didn't have the right to stop him from installing a vineyard in a hillside because he didn't move any earth to do it. So he claims that because no earth was harmed, he didn't move anything, he was in the right to do this. This is a very complicated lawsuit, and it's complicated for a lot of reasons. And I'm sure being in Napa Valley, you've heard some of the whispers or not so soft whispers of wineries and winemakers talking about the aftermath of these fires and the level of bureaucracy and red tape they have to go through to get themselves back into wine production mode again. And what I'm hearing is that, all right, so these fires come through, they take out your vineyard, they take out your winery. You just can't rebuild and can't just replant. There's a lot of things that have to happen, including permitting for trees to be removed, which can be extraordinarily expensive. I talked to a winemaker over on Spring Mountain who said it was going to cost him in the millions to remove dead trees not just because it was, of the labor, but because of the bureaucracy that he was going to have to go through to make sure that he wasn't disturbing these burned dead trees, to make sure that he wasn't disturbing the environment. Not only that, but like trying to get these wineries, trying to get insurance after the fires have come through, trying to get the permitting to rebuild. And then also, I think we talked a little bit about this, is like, you can't like, then you have to have like the proper roads so that the fire truck can come in. Like, there's so many things that have to happen post fire. Like, you've already dealt with this intense agony of what happens when your life's work is destroyed, and then after that trying to go through California red tape to like get yourself to a place where you're making money again is insane. And we're talking, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to make it happen. So as much as I think Jason Woodbridge is a bit of a character in California, and definitely not without what I will call some questionable behavior, I do think it's important that he kind of steps up and says, fine, we definitely don't want to disturb the earth, we definitely want to be sustainable, and we definitely want to be mindful about what we're doing, but also like there has to be some give and take here. What do you think about all this?
I agree. I mean, I've talked like you have to many people, vineyard owners, but people, we lost resorts have burned down here, and they're all just sort of stuck in this legal maelstrom of jumping through hoops, and it's really sad. I think if we could move quickly, we would, but everyone's a little bit hamstrung by all this like red tape, to your point. And also then there's not an unlimited amount of people that can go and do these inspections, and it takes a lot of time, and then you have to file it, and then you have to wait for it to be reviewed. So it's really sad. The other piece of this article that I think is very interesting, because there's that part of the lawsuit, but then it's almost like reminds me of like what is the definition of is, or do you remember this whole thing?
I was like, what was the case about? Yes.
Yeah. Because he's saying that he didn't plant the vines. He exposed them to the earth because he didn't plant them in a pot. So that what he did was indeed not planting a vineyard. He just exposed the vines to the earth. What do you think about that?
I mean, I'm not a viticulturist. So I can't weigh into like what that actually means, but I think he makes a point in saying like, all right, where do we draw the line? Like, if you're not disturbing the earth genuinely, like if we're not doing any harm, then what is the actual problem?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe we should also mention for anyone that isn't aware that in Napa Valley, there are very strict agricultural laws about where you can plant, and hillsides in particular are becoming, it's basically impossible at this point if you haven't already have one planted to plant a new hillside vineyard. So I think that's part of why this has become such an issue.
Yeah. Well, and the unfortunate part of all of this is that the reality is the only people, I mean, once this all gets taken care of, but like when we're talking about price of wine in Napa Valley, there's a big reason why wines are so expensive. And it really does come down to the fact that, like, obviously we want to protect the land. We've been under the Ag Preserve since 1968. It's important, but we also have to let people do business, right? Like, we also have to continue growing grapes and making wine and doing all those things. So, like, I get that the red tape has to be in place, but I feel like there has to be some give and take here. Like, it just feels so silly that, they're going to be wrapped up in crazy legal fees, and then who's that going to get passed off to? It's going to be in the end the consumer. And then, wine gets more and more expensive and difficult to consume and drink. And not that I think Jason Woodbridge really cares about how much his wine is, because it's pretty expensive as is. So, a few dollars here and there, but like that does trickle down. Like, if you're a small producer that lost their shirt in the fire, that does trickle down to the consumer in the end. So I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not going to Kim Kardashian my way into it and becoming a lawyer. So I'm just going to sit back and watch. But I do have an opinion in that I think business has to continue, and that we have to find a middle ground to make that happen while still protecting the land and the people that inhabit it. So that's all I'll say until we get to Portugal. First and foremost, we gotta thank our people for listening to our podcast. We are still getting some really wonderful reviews from you guys, and we love hearing from you. So if you're listening to this on any platform, please be sure to like, subscribe, review. Reviews really help. I know we talk about that a lot, but reviews are really helpful, not only our podcast succeeding, but also in helping other people to find us. So if you're enjoying it, please leave us a review. And this week, as always, we will read a review from one of you who left one. So thank you. So if you want to be one of the lucky people we read a review of, please go ahead and do that. This one is from Jason Standhope, who said, exciting show about wine. This podcast is a great mix of the personal side of wine and learning more about the technical side of wine. Very entertaining. Hey, Vanessa, we're entertaining. That's exciting.
Wow.
Wow.
I'm really glad to hear that, because otherwise we're just
doing this for?
What are we doing?
We're just entertaining ourselves.
We're just entertaining ourselves and drinking wine.
On that note, this podcast has a wine club, which means you can drink with us, alongside us, before us, after us, however you want to do it. The wines are available, and Vanessa and I pick them, and it's a very intense process that we go through. We have to sit and drink a lot of wines to figure out what we're going to do, but somebody's got to do it. So, if you want to be part of that process, join our wine club, have a little fun with us. And that's what we're going to do in just a second. So if you haven't grabbed your wine already, go ahead and do that. And we'll be back in just a second. All right, let's talk all things Portugal and wine. This is such an exciting region, and this is not our first time having a Portuguese wine on the show. We've had the Quinta Vale that we did with McCrossin. We did a port-style wine that was not from Portugal earlier with another guest. I think it was actually with Peter Billingsley. And this is the first time that we're really spending time on this region and diving into it. And it's been such an interesting region for me to not only discover pre-Portugal, but then now after being there, I really have a newfound appreciation. But I want to jump into port, which comes from Porto in Portugal. And I'm not going to admit to you how late in life I realized that correlation. But I want to jump into port and what port is, where it comes from. And if you've never had port before, you've probably seen it like on a wine list somewhere. Usually it's in the dessert section, but it's always going to be under a category called fortified wine. And fortified wine, Vanessa, I'd love for you to sort of break down what fortified wine is as a category before we get into how it's made in the region of Portugal.
Yeah, for sure. So fortified wine essentially is a wine that has had spirit added. So when we talk about, most wines that you drink at the table, they're fermented, to dryness or some version of dryness. But in this case, spirit is added. And in the case of something like port, it actually arrests or stops the fermentation before the yeast have consumed all the sugar. So what you're left with is a wine that has a lot of sweetness, but also has a higher level of alcohol than you would find in a table wine. So when we're talking about port, we're usually talking about, somewhere around 19%, ABV 20 in some cases. But whereas, for a table wine, sort of what's the highest you've ever seen? Probably around 16%. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah. So, but I think it's, there's so much to talk about in terms of the method of production there.
Yes.
So, the idea, and again, we have some dry wines that we're going to taste today, but for actual port, sweet style fortified wine, what you're really trying to do is get as much extraction out of the grapes very quickly, but very gently. So if you've ever seen, videos of people, stomping grapes or something with their feet, this is an actual thing that still happens. There are many mechanical ways to do this now in port production. But the reason why they did that is they were trying to get as much sort of extract and color out of the skins without breaking the seeds, which you can get sort of bitter tannins, astringency out of it. And sort of they realized that the human foot is the right balance of being able to get that extraction but not be too rough. And they do these they're called lagares, or sort of these low tanks, and it's quite a party.
Little mini swimming pools, right?
Exactly.
Little, like, fish ponds
exactly.
or something.
Exactly. I think it's quite a party. They sing, they dance, there's usually music, and
the windows are open, so there's no carbon monoxide poisoning.
Right. Very, very good point to make. But what happens is this is a short process. So it's only like a day or two. And then they add the spirit. And so it stops the fermentation because the spirit kills the yeast at that point. So
Portugal is probably most famous for port, right, which is the fortified wine, but there's many different wines that come out of Portugal, not just port. I think though it's probably one of the most interesting though, and so I want to start there before we dive into our dry wines and into the other regions. So if you want to look at Portugal as a whole, as a country, and kind of break it down into subregions, you've got Porto, which is where port comes from. Just like the region of Champagne, in order to call it port, it has to come from the region of Porto. In the Douro Valley. You've also got Vinho Verde, which is in the Minho region, and that's where all your kind of crispy whites are going to come from. And then you also have Alentejo, which is going to be down closer to Lisbon. And there's lots of grape growing that's happening all throughout Portugal. But those are the three primary regions that we're going to focus on today. And then we could also talk about Madeira, which is part of Portugal, but it's these little islands kind of off the coast of Portugal. Really interesting process. We could probably spend an entire episode just on Madeira. But I think for the purposes of this episode, we'll just focus on like the mainland grape growing. So port is coming from Portugal, coming from the region of Porto in the Douro Valley. And as you said, Vanessa, this is a really interesting process when it comes to fermenting, but when it comes to actually growing these grapes, it's actually a very normal process in some ways, right? So we talked earlier that you've got the Douro River that's coming in and kind of winding all the way through the region, which is further broken down into a few subregions. And the grapes grow on these crazy hillsides that really kind of you should look at pictures of this. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'll flash some photos from my trip. But these grapes grow all the way down basically to the edge of the water, and they're all terraced because we're talking about 30 to 40 degree slopes. There's really no other way you could do it. So you see, as you mentioned earlier, these stone walls that kind of keep everything up. What was really interesting was to watch harvest. I mean, these are crazy hillsides, and these guys are doing crazy long days work. But as I said, it's still a very normal process, and that the grapes are not harvested late. It's not like making Sauternes or a late harvest Riesling or something like that. These grapes are harvested as you would any other dry wine. They're harvested around 23 to 26 degrees Brix, although they don't really use Brix as a measurement there of sweetness. The grapes come in, they're destemmed, and then from there, that's when things sort of change a little bit. And when we're talking about grapes coming from this region, we're talking about a few predominant ones. Touriga Nacional, which I don't know if you were there, that they mentioned. Touriga Nacional is probably one of the closest in terms of flavor and texture profile to Cabernet Sauvignon. And if you've ever had just a straight Touriga Nacional, nothing blended into it, it does taste quite a bit like Cabernet Sauvignon. It's very inky, it's plushy, there's really great berry flavor to it. You've got Touriga Franca, which is sort of like they equate it to Cabernet Franc. Tinta Roriz and then Tinta Barroca are the predominant grapes that you're going to find not only in port wine, but in the region in the Douro Valley to make still wines as well. As you said, these grapes are brought in, and it's a really fun process to watch because, as you said, they're brought into these lagares. And what I never realized, and I thought this is so interesting, the reason that they really only have 24 to 48 hours is fermentation kicks off once you start breaking those skins. So it's kind of like a race to get as much extraction as they possibly can before all of that sugar gets converted to alcohol. So they're going to bring that sugar down to about half. And then, as you said, they're going to rest it with brandy, which is, neutral grape spirit. And then that wine is going to age. Now from there, and as if anybody's seen port on a wine list, from there, you've probably noticed that it doesn't just say port, right? It probably says tawny port or ruby port or vintage port. And so there's all these different styles of port that can be made after that initial process. And that all happens in the aging process. Now, I did hint before that the region of Gaia is a really important one when it comes to making port. And that's because in this region, in the Douro Valley, it's very hot. It's very dry. They actually don't get a ton of water, even though they're on the river there. It's actually a very dry place. And so what happens, and there's also no space, right? You're on hillsides. There's nowhere to do these things. So they vinify everything there. And then traditionally what would happen is they'd put it in barrels and then they'd ship it on down the river, down to the region of Gaia, which sits on the opposite side of Porto. And that's where you're going to find all of the port houses, just kind of like lining the side of the river. It's really, really cool to see. And when you go inside and you visit these places, you'll see not a new barrel in sight, not one. In fact, they are quite old. And that was a really interesting thing for me because I just, it never occurred to me that like these wines were not aged in new oak. In fact, you said you didn't get out there, but so you probably didn't see this. They have like barrel fixers on site. So they've had these barrels for, anywhere from 40 to 100 years. And so there's these guys that are full-time staff that go around to all the barrels and they look at these barrels and they decide, if they maybe need to fix a few things here, but they try to keep these barrels for as long as they can. And so that's a big part of the aging process. But I want to talk a little bit about ruby versus tawny versus vintage. And maybe Vanessa, you can jump into like what the difference is in terms of aging and what that looks like for some of these different styles.
Yeah, totally. No, and I think often they're referred to as bottle aged or cask aged, but I think that's a little bit confusing sometimes to people because even the bottle aged are aged in cask for a period of time. So I often just like to say red port or tawny port.
Okay.
But red port, or what you might hear as tawny port, are wines that are aged for a shorter amount of time in cask before they're bottled. And there are different quality levels within there. So like just sort of basic ruby is going to be aged for a very short time before it's bottled. That's kind of the most affordable, not meant to, put in your cellar for a long amount of time. Ruby Reserve aged for a little longer in cask before it's bottled, 3 to 4 years. And I'll just pause for 1 second to say the reason why they age these wines in cask is they're really fiery. Because if you think about that spirit that was added,
that's a good point.
It needs a little time to mellow out. So this is why in the quality level, they go up the longer that these red ports are aged in cask. Late bottled vintage is a red port or a bottle aged port that's bottled after 4 to 6 years in cask. I think this is a great value because these are ready to drink when you buy them. Whereas vintage port, you actually are not meant to open these for a long amount of time. So vintage port is actually aged for less than late bottled vintage, and you're meant to put it down. And this is why often I think, Amanda, birth years are a big thing, right?
Yes.
People buy the birth year for their children and they put it away for many, many years. And then you can open it, 21 years later or later with your kids. So that's the red port. And then tawny port is cask aged for a much, much longer time. And it is different color. So red ports, as they age, they will get sort of lighter in color, but they really are red. They're dark, they're inky, they're, opaque. Tawny port is that more brownish color, and you'll hear things like 20-year, 30-year, 40-year tawny ports. That is not an actual age of the wine. That's an indication of the average age because younger wines are blended into these casks. So it's an average age of the wines that you find there. But those tend to be, you don't need to age tawny ports. You can drink them as you buy them, and they're just sort of softer, more mellow. You don't get that sort of fiery tannic nature that you do from red port.
Tawny, I think for me is my favorite best value, and for a few reasons. I think one of the reasons, you may have said it, but maybe I missed it. The other thing about tawny is like it's intentionally oxidized, right? So they're not topping up these barrels. They're just kind of letting them go. And so they're exposed to oxygen to sort of accelerate that aging process, which means, as you said, once you buy it, it's ready to drink. But then also, once you open it, because it's already been exposed to oxygen and it's already been intentionally oxidized, that bottle will stay good open in your fridge for like 6 months. Like you can genuinely keep tawny port in your fridge for like a very long time without it really going anywhere. So for me, that makes it the better value because I don't know about you, but like after dinner and I just want like something a little bit sweet, a nice like small glass of tawny port, and we should talk about the pour sizes of these wines probably. A nice glass of tawny port is a really great way to have like dessert without having dessert. It's, just have like a few ounces. We mentioned earlier that these are much more alcoholic than your standard table wines. So anywhere from like 19 to 21%, somewhere in there, which means you probably shouldn't have like a full 5 to 6 ounce pour. Literally, no one will judge you if you do. But you should not be surprised if in a restaurant you get a much smaller glass. They've got port glasses that will be about 2 to 3 ounces. And that's just, one, that they're very sweet. If they're made well, they're very, very balanced. So it's not like you're drinking syrup. They actually still, because these grapes are harvested as you would any other grape for a dry wine, they have really great acidity. So they're picking not only for ripeness, but they're also picking for acid because they know that because there's going to be such a high amount of sugar, you need acid to balance. So these aren't flabby wines, they're not syrupy wines. They are certainly sweet wines, but they are balanced wines. So for me, a tawny port is kind of where it's at. In terms of pairing these wines, you can have a lot of fun. And I think, we talk about the fact that sweet wines should be paired with sweet foods, right? So your wine should be as sweet or sweeter than the food that you're pairing with, which means if you got a brownie, you probably don't want to do it with a dry wine because it's going to make that brownie taste a little weird. But you could pair it with something like a ruby port, because I really like chocolate and ruby port together. Those are really delicious pairings. So if you're someone that's like chocolate and Cabernet isn't always the best pairing for chocolate because it's dry, but ruby port to me always kind of felt like if Cabernet, like Napa Cab, had like a ton of sugar in it, that's kind of what ruby tastes like. It's really juicy and it's sweet and it's lush, and that's really just delicious with all your chocolate things. So anything in that red category is great with chocolate. When it comes to vintage, which is still part of that red wine category, I like to move to the cheese side of dessert with that because I think there's just a little bit more acidity that you find in the vintage ports. There's a bit more balance. And so I like that with cheese. Remember, cheese, just like sweet stuff, cheese has an incredible amount of acidity and you want your acids to match. So you need your wine to be as high or higher in acidity when it comes to pairing. And cheese has a lot of acidity, as I said. And then when it comes to tawny port, this is my favorite. If you happen, when you were in Portugal, did you have pastel de nata?
No. Tell me.
No? Oh, man. Okay. So I had one of these like at least once a day. So pastel de nata is like the signature breakfast, lunch, dessert. Kind of have it anytime. You find them pretty much at anywhere you get coffee, or there's even like entire like bakeries dedicated to making pastel. So it's pastel. It looks like pastel de nata. All the s's in Portuguese are esh. So it's pastel de nata. If it's plural, it's pastéis. It's basically like a little mini creme brulee in like a puff pastry almost. And so, but they bake them at they don't like flambe them like creme brulee. They bake them at a super high temperature. So it's kind of like creamy and custardy in the center and then just slightly burnt on top. So you get this sort of like caramelly vanilla nuttiness. And that's what you want to do with tawny port. Tawny port with anything vanilla, nutty, caramelly, custardy, those things. Oh my God. Like if your mouth isn't watering right now, there's something wrong with you. That is one of like God's great gifts to us in the food and wine pairing world, like truly delicious pairing. So if you got a creme brulee or like a caramelly dessert or flan in your future, grab a bottle of tawny port. We should talk about the prices of these wines, speaking of which, because as you mentioned, great birth year wines, because there's so much value there and these wines age forever. You've been in retail for a long time, so you probably have a better gauge on like where you should kind of be looking in terms of price for some of these bottles.
For basic ruby, you can buy it for like, in the $20 range. They can be quite affordable, late bottled vintage, maybe, 40s, maybe 50, depending on the producer. Vintage, you're going to look, upwards towards $100, ish or more. But still, when you think about something that can age that long, that's actually quite a value.
It's huge value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and something else, if I think is so fascinating while we're still talking about port, is just a little bit of the history, which I think is so interesting for so many wine regions, that there's usually part necessity and part politics that have led to a lot of things. So, the reason why port sort of became popular originally was there was a conflict between England and France, and this is in the 17th century, and England banned the importer sale of French wines, and so they went to Portugal, and I think they still have the longest running treaty in the world. I think this is still in place. That it's the Treaty of Methuen,
Mm,
and so that they could freely trade. But this was also the time of great exploration, and this is happening on ships. And what they
mm.
real and they always wanted to take alcohol on the ships, right? But what they
Naturally.
realized,
Who doesn't want to do a booze cruise in the
exactly.
1400s?
Exactly. And what they realized is that when wine was fortified with spirit, it was more stable and could last long and could hold up on these long ocean trips with, lots of different variation of temperature because it's just more sturdy.
These wines can age for a very long time. Now, we had mentioned ruby, you don't want to age a ruby, but we're talking about vintage port. I mean, those can age for 50 years, 100 years. I mean, they can go a very, very long time because of the sugar, which is a preservative, because of the fortification with the brandy. These wines have a very, very long shelf life and are delicious with age. I mean, truly some of the most beautiful wines in the world. Port is wildly underrated, and I just like for the life of me cannot understand why it hasn't had the popularity in current days that it should. It was interesting when I was there. So I was with this Symington family who they own Grahams and Dows and Coburns. It's pronounced Coburns, not Cockburns. Um, if you see it, now you know. It was funny. We actually had like a fun conversation about that. But anyway, I was talking to Rupert Symington. And he said, back in the 70s, Port and Bordeaux were the same price. First growth Bordeaux, which you think about it now, like you can't get a first growth Bordeaux for less than what, $500 a bottle.
Yeah.
But you can get a bottle of vintage port for like 100. That's an insane value. And when you look at what goes into making these wines and the ageability and the consistency of them, really, really impressive. And one thing that we didn't mention, that vintage port is not made in every vintage. In
That's
fact,
right.
only about 3 to 4 per decade that are declared, and it's actually a really interesting process that they have to go through in order. Portugal, like a lot of European countries, very particular about their name brand, right? So if you're going to put their country on there, it needs to represent them properly. So there's actually a government organization that tastes the wines and will allow you or not allow you to declare a vintage. So if you're Grams and you decide you want to declare the 2022 vintage, you can do that. And a lot of times the port houses will all kind of come together and decide to declare a vintage. But if you wanted to declare a vintage outside of, a declared vintage, you do either way, you have to go get that approved. And sometimes they approve it, sometimes they don't. One other thing, and not to complicate things too much, but I don't know, I'm sure you spent a little time at some of these like little quintas, the little wineries, right? I didn't know that they made single quinta ports until I went there. And I think these are some of the best value too, because these you're getting, where else in the world can you go and get a single vineyard wine that's less expensive than a blended wine? Does that make sense to you? We had a whole conversation about it. I was like, wait a minute.
There's a lot
How
of
are these
things.
how are these less expensive?
Yeah.
So you can get a vintage single, so made from a specific vintage, which is often outside of the declared vintages, single quinta, single vineyard port for like 60 to 70% of like what the declared vintage of like all the combined. So fascinating to me. So there, you might see those out and about. I think they're smaller production, but I thought that was really interesting. Anything else that we need? I mean, I could talk for like days about port, but we do have a couple dry wines in front of us, and specifically one that's in the wine club, and I don't want to keep everyone waiting. But if there's anything else we should add, we should add it now.
There's just one thing about service which can be kind of fun, is to see port tongs being used.
Yes.
And why you might use those. Did you see that while you were there?
I didn't. It was a little bit more well, maybe I didn't see it. So the ports just always happened to arrive in front of me. So they never did port tong service.
I need to travel with you.
Yes.
So these port tongs, they're literally these tongs, and they heat them over a flame until they are literally red hot. And what they do is they put them around the neck of the bottle, and it basically completely cleanly takes off the neck of the bottle with the cork in it. And the reason why you might want to do that is in some cases, this is usually done, unless it's just being done for show, is usually done on very older ports. And that's because sometimes the cork is very delicate. If you try to put a corkscrew or even an Osso or Duran through it, it could crumble. And so with these older ports, they just don't even bother. So it's a way to have, a very clean wine without risking the cork, but also it's just really fun to watch.
It is really fun to watch. And a couple of restaurants, like so 11 Madison Park does it, tableside, not just for port, they'll do it for dry wines as well. So they'll score it on the neck. And I had never done it during service, like when I was a som. But they'll score it with these tongs, and then it's thermodynamics. And like I said, I'm not a scientist, but it's thermodynamics. And then they brush it with a little bit of water, and then the neck snaps off. A lot of times what they'll do is they'll filter it. I mean, there's no wine bottle glass doesn't shatter, or like it doesn't have glass shards like a lot of other glass. It breaks a little bit different, but it's a clean break. But oftentimes they'll filter it through. I have a whole tutorial on my TikTok. Actually, I'll post it on our Instagram so you can see it. It's really fun if you want to give it a try. And it's like, to me, it's like, it's more fun than saber. It's a lot more work than sabering, but it's more fun than sabering. And like I said, you can do it with pretty much any bottle. You don't want to do it. You only want to do it with a bottle that has an actual cork in it. So you don't want to do it with a tawny port, which has a T enclosure. So you'll see it's kind of like a spirits enclosure that you'd see like on a bourbon. Cause once you put those heated tongs on, that T enclosure will just like pop right off. So you want to make sure it has an actual cork, but it's really fun to do. Unfortunately, no, we didn't see it at all in Portugal. Man, that was a bummer. A whole month in Portugal, no port tongs. Let's talk a little about these dry wines. So we have one of the great examples of a great dry red wine from Europe, really well priced. We always like to talk about Spain as being great region for well priced reds. I think Portugal. I think they're one step above Spain for me. Maybe not in terms of like, they're not making Unico, right? So you don't have like although you do. Crochet is great, which is a collaboration between Pratt's and Symington's. But when we're talking about $10 to $20 red wines that are really delicious and really well made, I think Portugal is where it's at. I mean, it was so hard to find a wine that was expensive in Portugal, but they were all so good. Yeah. I mean, literally, like every restaurant you go to, it's like €5 for a glass of wine, and they were amazing. And this is one of them. So if you're drinking with us, this is from the Douro region. So this is Vale de Cavalos, Vinho Tinto, red wine. So, red wine from the 2019 vintage. And as we talked about earlier, just like with port, this is actually made from the same grapes that port wine is made from. So the same fortified version of this wine. So this is 50% Touriga Nacional, 20% Touriga Franca, 20% Tinto Roriz, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is Tempranillo. Is that right?
It's the same. Yes, it's the same variety as Tempranillo.
And 10% Tinto Barroca. So you're getting all 5 of the varieties in here. It's really like bright and brambly and like a little bit graphite-y. Like if you were to blind this, you might think it was a Cabernet blend, right?
Yeah,
like just off the nose.
100%. I think you described Touriga Nacional really well earlier. It is very Cabernet-like. Particularly, it has that sort of structure to the tannin, sort of very fine-grained tannin. And I mean, absolutely. I used to, when I was studying for the tasting exam, I used to try to blind taste Douro red blends next to Bordeaux because, you have to look, these are riper, they're a little bit more floral, blue fruit, but in some cases they're quite similar.
Yeah, for me, like as I'm tasting now, this has a little bit of a chill on it. I like my Portuguese reds, both fortified and non-fortified, with a little chill. And in fact, if you're drinking port fortified wine, I would definitely have a little bit of a chill on that. So stick that in your fridge for at least like 15, 20 minutes. And I like this with a little chill. I think I like most of my reds with a chill, but I like this with a slight chill on it. It's pop and pour ready to go. You don't need to decant it. I mean, certainly a little air won't hurt, but I would treat this just like you would a Bordeaux blend or a Cabernet blend from Napa, right? So you're going to serve it in a Bordeaux glass. You might decant it. You're probably going to want steak or something, red meat or something, a big protein with it, grilled vegetables, something with a char, something like that. You want to treat this just like you would any other like Bordeaux blend, but this is coming from Portugal and it's different grapes. As we said, these grapes are coming from these crazy terraced vineyards. They're harvested, as you would any other. So there's nothing weird about it, but you can't beat the price. And I feel like I'm screaming from the rooftops that Portuguese wine is like, it's where it's at, and it's really, really, really hard to spend a lot of money on them because they're just, and the quality is there. I think anytime we try to wine, we're like, you've got to be kidding me. That's like, it can't be that much money.
I agree with you, but I'm just loving your enthusiasm today. You really are. Like, I mean, everything you say is exactly correct, but it's awesome. It's probably what I sound like when I talk about champagne.
Who knew Portugal would bring it out of me? I really did fall in love with this place. I love the people. I love the culture. I really felt like being there gave me such a great appreciation for winemaking again. And, we're surrounded by such great winemakers and beautiful vineyards in Napa. But, it was so fun seeing, a different culture do their thing and seeing how they adapt to all of this, similar or different challenges that you would any other wine region. And the fact that they're making these wines for the price that they are and having such pride in what they're making is really cool. I think the other thing to note, the natural wine scene is really big in Portugal. And I think it's because, grapes are very inexpensive there. It's not like California where like, well, I'm getting $10,000 an acre or a ton to make Cabernet Sauvignon, right? And so I'm going to make the best Cabernet Sauvignon that I possibly can. I'm not going to make, a natural wine that I'm going to sell for $20. I think Portugal is really interesting in that they can kind of do what they want because they're getting the same price regardless. So you're seeing a huge amount of young winemakers really having some fun with the natural wine scene, playing around with different varieties. There's a ton of like Masal selection going on because they're like, we don't know what's planted. We're just going to make it. So they're like, they're taking over like their family vineyards and they're doing their thing. And so whether that's a pet nat or something else, really, really delicious and really well made. I mean, we're talking clean style natural wines. Whether or not I'm ever going to see any of those again in the United States remains to be seen. But I do think it's worth noting that if you are visiting the region, definitely embrace the natural wine scene. Try everything. I mean, it's so inexpensive when you consider what the United States charges for wine. So I think it's really fun. And in fact, when we were in Lisbon, we went to this great natural wine bar that was recommended called Black Sheep. It was so cool. It was in the Bairro Alto sub-region neighborhood. And they had like 4 seats at the bar. The place is packed, so there's no chance of getting a seat. But you kind of like wave your hand and they see you and they're super sweet and very friendly. And, they have anywhere from like 50 to 70 wines open a night there, and all different. And you go up and they say, you want rosé, you want white, you want red, you want sparkling. You say, I want red. And they pour you like 5 different tastes of these wines. There's like 20 people behind me. They do this for every single person and they're charging like €6 a glass. But the best part is you decide. I'm so excited. The best part is so you decide what glass you want, right? They give you your glass, great little shot Sviesel glass. And right on outside is this beautiful park and a pizza place right next door. And so you just go walk around with your glass of wine in Lisbon in the park, grab a pizza and chill with like everybody else there on a Friday night. I'm telling you, it was a game changer. Like it blew my mind how cool it was that you could just like have this very civilized experience with wine in this beautiful place. It was tree lined and gorgeous, and eat some pizza while you're at it. Anyway, that's all to say, like, if you're visiting, which I obviously recommend you should, definitely take advantage of that. And also shout out to Genuino and Porto if you happen to be in Porto, another great natural wine bar that we spent way too much time at. We also need to talk a little bit about Vinho Verde, which you have or have not been to, Vanessa.
I have not been.
But you're obviously familiar with Vinho Verde, and I've talked about Vinho Verde before on my channels. And I love Vinho Verde as a wine producing region because they produce really delicious, crisp, fresh white wines. They do produce some red wines. I'm not confident that's where they should be putting their money. We'll just leave it at that.
Oh, okay.
But they do produce really, really delicious, inexpensive white wines. And for the longest time, you'll always see, for the most part, a little bit of CO2 in the bottling. And that stems from the fact that they were the fermentation was kind of inadvertently happening again in the bottle, so you're getting like a faux pet nat
Spritz.
situation, a little spritz action. But now they just add it at the end. But what's happening in Vinho Verde is they're obviously known for these fresh, crisp whites, but they're also trying to promote a longer lasting, more age-worthy white wine, which is actually what we have here. So this is coming from a vineyard that I actually visited called Soalheiro. And this is 100% Alvarinho. So the grapes, I think there's 45 varieties allowed in Vinho Verde, but there's only a few that they really play with. Alvarinho is probably the most expensive. But do you want to guess like how much a ton of grapes costs in Vinho Verde?
$500.
Anywhere between $500 and $1,000 a ton.
Okay.
With Alvarinho being the most expensive.
I mean, when you put that in perspective to Napa, I mean, I think you said $10,000 a ton for Cabernet, but if we're talking some of these vineyards, it's $50,000 in some cases.
I was going to say, not if it's spec stopper.
Not if it's spec stopper. So that's astounding. And can you clear something up for me? Because Vinho Verde, so like green wine, I heard originally they're like, oh, it's because these wines have a greenish tint. Then someone said, no, it's actually because they're bottled very young and fresh. So
it's actually neither. It's because the region is so green. So Vinho Verde is named for the greenness of the region. They get about 1,200 millimeters of rain per year. So they get a ton of rain there. Not usually during like their growing season. Usually it's, between October and like April, May. But it's very, very lush there. So that's actually where the name comes from.
There you
go.
Thank you.
I don't think it's wrong to say that though, because interestingly, when I would go out to places, a lot of times they would offer you red, white, or green wine, and like that happened a few times. We were like, it like took me by surprise, and I was like, excuse me. So yeah, green wine is often referred to, as Vinho Verde. The region's enormous. I'll read you some of the stats because it's pretty astounding. So you've got several different sub-regions within Vinho Verde. Like I said, 45 allowed varieties, but only about 6 of those are primarily used. Alvarinho is a synonym for Alvarinho in Spain. That's the most expensive of the grapes. So that goes for a whopping $1,000 or euros a ton. Avesso, Loureiro, Rinto, and Trajadora and Azal, although I saw very little Azal. And we actually got to taste these individually and do a little bit of blend. But these are interesting factoids for you. 16,000 hectares of vineyards, 16,000 growers, but only 370 bottlers. So there's more growers than producers. And here's why. So the region of Vinho Verde, unlike the Douro, was not winemaking grape dominant. It was a bunch of families and farmers who would have their plots of land, and around the perimeter, that's where the grapes were grown. So they'd have all their crops for like eating, but then they would grow the grapes around that and they would sell them as a secondary source of income. So grape growing was not, so when you go to Vinho Verde, you're not going to see these large, sprawling, contiguous vineyards. When you look out, you're going to see a patchwork of houses and like backyard farms with a couple of like vineyards planted. But the vines also don't look anything like you've ever seen. Have you ever heard of a pergola training system?
I have. Yes. They're very high, right? Yes.
Mm-hmm. You can walk
underneath them.
Underneath of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if you're watching the YouTube video, I'll post the video of me actually walking. I know that I'm only 5'2", but still I could walk with entire head clearance with the vines above me. And you look up and the vine, the grapes were just like hanging above. It's a very different way of producing grapes. And in fact, it's still very like neighborly and like familial. And like when you go to Soalheiro and you're walking from the tasting room facility down to the vineyard, you're like walking between people's houses. Like there's a school and then people's backyards and like laundry hanging. So it's not like you go to these vineyards and like that's the only thing you see. Like you're literally looking into like their neighbor's window, like watching them make breakfast. Like it's a very different experience. But what's really cool is, grape growing is really more of a secondary source of income. They take a lot of pride in doing it, but what they do is they take off like an entire month around August and September to harvest not only their own vineyard, but also their neighbor's vineyard. So they'll all do this together. And that's, that's what they do to earn a little extra money. And then like take like a little vacation and help each other out. So it's a really interesting place to grow grapes. There's only a few regions that, really focus where you see terraced vines. And those grow a little bit closer to the Douro. There was something else I was going to say on that note, though. Oh, so the one region that I think is really interesting, and I think I wanted to go back to this Soalheiro. Did you try it yet, by the way?
I did. It's delicious. And I think
Isn't
it's
it
like
delicious?
when you're talking about them trying to make more age-worthy wine, like this is a serious wine.
Yes. So what you see a lot in Vinho Verde is not only the addition of CO2, but you see the addition of sugar a lot. So these are very low alcohol wines, usually about 11 to 12%. But a lot of times they're adding a little bit of sweetness because the acidity is so high and because that's sort of become the style. So they're adding sugar. But then you've got producers like Soalheiro that are not necessarily adding sugar. Maybe they're adding a few grams per liter here and there. So it's a much more serious. But in where Soalheiro is in the sub-region of Moncao a Melgaco, which you can only produce Alvarinho from there. So all the other regions, you're going to see a blend of the other grapes. This is the only place where you're going to see 100% Alvarinho. And in order to say Moncao and Melgaco, that's what has to be in the bottle. This is a very high quality Vinho Verde, and this is where you're seeing a lot of the producers start to move toward. So they're not injecting CO2, they're not adding sugar. They're doing things just a little bit differently than the rest of the region. And I think they're waiting for the rest of the region to sort of catch up. Interestingly, not a ton of organic farming happening. They're having a lot of trouble figuring that out. I think one, because of the cost of being organic, but also just because it is such a wet region. They're having a lot of issues
humidity.
With Exactly.
Yeah.
So they're still working that stuff out. So a lot of these wines are not going to be organically grown. I think, they're definitely moving towards like minimal stuff, and Soalheiro for sure is more minimal intervention. The other thing that they do is kind of like our friend Annie Fabia in Cubesville.
Yes.
She's got her Area Tea project. They also grow herbal teas in their vineyard. So if you go to Soalheiro, you can have a little herbal tea alongside your Vinho Verde. But I want to talk a little bit about this wine before we wrap up, because it's so like bright and crisp and fresh and lemony, but there is like almost like a Sauvignon, like a Sauvignon Blanc quality to it, where it's like very citrusy and lemony, but
it's a
kind
little
of between like a Sauvignon Blanc and a Chardonnay, like a little appley as well.
It's a little salty too, which I'm enjoying.
And there is like a little bit of spritz there. It's clean, it's crisp, it's vibrant. To me, like if you're gonna drink, and it's textured, right? So as we head into like these cooler months, we start talking about our winter white wines. I think this is a great example of a good winter white that can pair with lots of different things. Serve it chilled. Don't, make it super, super icy. In a white wine glass, a standard white wine glass, like you would a Sauvignon Blanc, is appropriate for this wine. And, anything from cheese to lighter proteins, fish, fresh vegetables, even root vegetables as we get into those. You can have a lot of fun with this wine, or you can just drink it by itself. This was the wine that was not in the wine club. This is available on Wine Access, as is the Douro Red. We covered so much, and I feel like I've been like enthusiastically over communicating my entire trip as I've tried to download an entire month's worth of learning. What I miss? Anything?
I mean, I'm just gonna say, I will not be surprised when you tell me that you're moving to Portugal.
I'm not moving to Portugal.
Based on our discussion today, I'm just saying it's awesome. Yeah. I love it. You're clearly so passionate, and came away with such deep knowledge but enthusiasm for the wines from this country. It's wonderful. I mean, this is the best part of wine travel, right? Is coming back with this.
It really is.
New lens and understanding, and then being able to tell people about it, because I learned so much from you today.
Well, thanks. I feel the same. Wine travel is so important. As much as Wine Access does an amazing job at conveying the stories behind every bottle, I think being there is no substitution. Seeing it, meeting the people, watching things happen, seeing the land, feeling the weather, you really do get a different appreciation for these places and the wines that come from them. So very, very grateful to Vinho Verde and to the Symington family for giving me the opportunity to come over there And to myself, great job on making this a possibility to spend a month in Portugal. Well done, me.
I second
I'm
that.
teasing, of course. Yes. No, super. I hope to be back soon. But in the meantime, I have the wines to keep me occupied. We did have some questions for the audience before we go. So let's knock through these a little bit. Are all port wines super sweet? I mean, mostly.
If we're talking fortified, yes. I mean, they can vary in their level. But again, we had 2 dry wines from Portugal. So
we did.
But port, yes,
exactly.
Sweet.
Yes. Port itself, not necessarily wines from Portugal.
Exactly.
What this is something that I actually did miss that I'm shocked that I did. What are some of your favorite port cocktails? Did you have white port and tonic while you were over there?
I absolutely did. Yes.
How is this not a thing all over the United States? What is happening that we have not caught on to white port and tonic?
It's so refreshing, and it's less boozy than gin.
Yes.
So you can, especially on a hot day, you can have a couple. You're not going to be under the table. And this is, I mean, you go there. This is their cocktail. This white port and tonic. Although I will say, we didn't mention this, but they're starting to make more and more pink port. Which is often used in cocktails as well.
Yeah, pink port is good. It's a little sweeter than the white port. But yeah, if you love gin and tonic or like any sort of like and tonic combination, I highly recommend getting yourself a bottle of white port and doing, a little white port and tonic. They're delicious with just a squeeze of lime. How long can port age for? We covered this a little bit. Ruby, you don't really want to age that. It'll stay fresh in your open for like 2 weeks. Vintage port, like we said, 50 to 100 years. All the others you really don't want to age. They're kind of ready to go. They're not going to go bad, but they're not meant for aging. And then in terms of once vintage port is open, again, like I think of it as like 2 to 3 weeks is kind of like where you want to be max for those things. All great questions. Who are some of the top producers you recommend trying?
My favorite is Quinta de Noval. I love them. I love their dry wines. I like their port. They have that block. I think it's just called Nacional of pre-phylloxera vines on the property. They don't let anyone walk in this vineyard, by the way, because these are for obvious reasons. But there was something about them I really fell in love with them when I visited. Although the Symingtons are amazing as well, of course. I mean, it's hard to say, and everyone is so nice.
Yes. Yeah, they all drink a little bit differently. I think if you're someone that wants a little bit sweeter, Graham's tends to be a little sweeter than Coburn's, which tends to be drier. Dow's tends to be a little drier as well, so just slightly less sweetness. But if you like them super syrupy and sweet, still balanced, Graham's is kind of where it's at. I think Graham's 20-year tawny is like kind of one of my favorite wines on the planet. Like there's very few things that beat that for me. How can I make port a part of my normal wine enjoyment? Any savory dish pairings?
Cheese.
Yeah. Cheese, for sure. I mean, you can definitely pair port with more savory dishes. It wouldn't be my first choice, but certainly I've definitely had great experiences with like steak and a sweeter wine, especially if it's like really, really salty and very umami, or even like dry aged, where it's very gamey. A lot of times that sweetness can be really nice. You could also do it with, and it would be a little bit tricky, especially because it's fortified. You could do it with spicier food. Just make sure that whatever you're doing isn't like too spicy, or like the fortification of the alcohol can kind of like amplify that instead of the sweetness cutting it. So that would be my recommendation. But cheese for sure. Okay, that is our show. Thank you so much for being here. If you're a member of the Wine Access Unfiltered Wine Club, I really hope you enjoyed these wines for this episode. And if you did, Instagram them, tag us so we can repost you, and then also let us know with a review and a like and subscribe or a comment below. If you haven't signed up for it yet, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. Every 4 episodes, you get a new shipment of wines. There's 4 wines per shipment. And as I said, Vanessa and I select them ourselves. So you know that they're selfish picks because we drink them.
The one time I'm not afraid to say I'm selfish is with the wine picks.
Yes. We're both very selfish with our wines. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Wine Access Unfiltered podcast produced by Chappy Cottrell. We're your hosts, Amanda McCrossin and Vanessa Conlin. Thank you so much for listening, and cheers.